Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had a pleasant lunch. We come to a section in our agenda that is really, I think, a little bit of a new departure for the BEREC Stakeholder event. This is our third year, and we felt, in particular with so much talk about digital single market and a new framework, so much looking to the future, what we should do today is have a session that involved a much broader view of the digital ecosystem than that normally concerns us as communications regulators. So we want to explore this broader digital space and think a little bit about what the future might be. It will probably be a future where regulators, such as us, play only a small part in that digital ecosystem, but I think still a very valuable and important part. So, to allow this debate to happen, we thought it would be very useful to have players from that system of the future. In Professor Thomas Horn from the University of Munster, we have somebody, I think, who can give us a horizontal view across a whole range of issues, and we're delighted to have him here today. And then in Google, AT&T and Ericsson, we have three major global players, all who have different activities, different roles in this digital ecosystem, all who are developing their own business models into the future. So we're interested in talking about the future a little bit. The famous, I think he was Danish, atomic physicist Niels Bohr said, prediction is difficult, especially when it's about the future. But today we're hoping that our esteemed guests can give us some predictions for the future, and we can think as regulators about what our role might be in that space. I'm delighted that Philippe Dufresne from Cullen International will moderate the session. Philippe will be known to, I think, nearly everybody in this room and has worked for over 25 years in this space with Cullen, working in 50 different countries with a range of regulators and operators and other stakeholders. So without further ado, I will hand over to Philippe to moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That's right. I started in this sector when it was called telecom. Now, I know 13 years ago we decided to call it electronic communication, and I'm so pleased that BEREC invited me to moderate a very distinguished panel that is not about the tubes, but rather about the rest of the ecosystem. I think it will be a refreshing change for many of us in this room. And because, as somebody pointed out in the panel on IoTs, connectivity is of course key, but storage, analytics, presentation are what is required to deliver the transformational effect that we hope ICT will have on our societies. And I think usually conference organizers have two ways of arranging panels. Either they hire 4 top experts with similar expertise and they hope they will disagree. That usually provide a good fight, ideal for after lunch discussions. Or, as BEREC did it in its great wisdom today, they invite 4 top experts with different expertise to shed a different light on this complex debate. And as Kevin said, we have in Professor Jan Oren from the University of Munster, a top legal expert of this field who, I need to warn you, BEREC has a critical view on your recent report on OTT. It means you have an open mind by daring to invite him. So congratulations for that. We have in Jan Tari, head of standardization of Ericsson, a top expert of this complex world, the complex for me word of standardization, and we will need Jan to discuss issues that I hear more and more about, like interoperability. We have in Len Kali somebody who is a top expert in regulation, and Len is a senior VP with AT&T, but he's got global responsibility. He's just back from South Africa, so it's not just a view from the US, it's really a view from the rest of the world. And last but not least, we have Carlo Dazzaro Biondo, who is heading for Google strategic partnership, one of the topics that we will discuss here. So without further ado, I suggest that we can start with the presentation. Do you wish to start, Len? As you,
Sure.
you are the one who traveled the furthest to get here, so I think you should go first.
All right, so there are slides. I'm wondering if there's a clicker here. Yes, okay. All right, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I thought I would start with a quote that has some currency on the internet right now, and it's quite descriptive of the digital ecosystem. So it begins, when wireless is perfectly applied, the whole earth will be converted into a huge brain. We shall be able to communicate with one another instantly, irrespective of distance, and the instruments through which we shall be able to do this will be amazingly simple compared with our present telephone. It's really not too surprising a statement today. What is surprising about it was made in 1926 by Nikola Tesla. Yeah. And it's quite prescient. And what I would add to it is that the network makes all this work. The network makes the devices and the people communicate. And in fact, that the handset is going to be the remote control for this new digital future we're entering and already beginning. To the extent there's a need for human interaction, the handset will be the device for everything from talking and text to monitoring and activating all the devices the prior panel was talking about. You'll be using that handset or a similar device. Now, we've waited a long time since 1926 for this idea to come to fruition and the technology to be ready to really make this possible. And we know from the history of wireless that things should move pretty quickly. So I've collected a set of data points here. The data points themselves are actually less significant than the point I want to make, which is we've seen just amazing and aggressive growth in this space. So wireless connections, mobile video, wireless penetration, wireless revenue, wireless investment have all grown dramatically and are projected to continue to grow dramatically. In fact, investment in wireline and wireless broadband networks in the US over about the last 15 years have exceeded $1.3 trillion, an enormous sum of money that's been invested in broadband, in the networks, in this digital revolution. But I'm somewhat afraid that these numbers and numbers like them have lulled people into a sense that this is inevitable, that this growth is inevitable and these investments will continue. And I suggest that not. The torrent of investment we've seen in the US resulted from a number of specific factors, including a very deliberate light touch regulatory regime. So the question here in Europe and in the US as well is whether this type of growth can continue into the future. Is it inevitable? Will it occur everywhere, including Europe, including the US? In short, are we going to be able to foster or will we inadvertently slow these developments? So I'd like to discuss these questions in the context of 4 industry trends, and we could touch on regulatory issues as we talk briefly about those trends. So video is the first trend, and as you may know, AT&T has placed a very big bet on video with our acquisition of a direct broadcast satellite provider, DTV, in the US. But the question is really as much about connectivity as it is about pay TV. This is because video service helps pay for the broadband connectivity. This is especially so in the US, where we see customers preferring to buy TV in bundles with broadband, and also customers tending to use packages of pay TV along with over-the-top video. So video, of course, is more than just entertainment. We are seeing an explosion of video across our network, about half of total traffic today. So it includes everything from entertainment to things like home security cameras, baby cams, elder cams, business video conferencing. And video is demanding in a number of ways. Obviously, capacity and speed. In some applications, latency and jitter matter. And the trend on video, we believe, will continue. And it'll continue to pressure wireless as well as wireline networks. And that's basically because our customers are choosing to consume video and to create video over mobile devices where and when they want, and we've got to be able to support that. So my message in talking about video, in addition to just saying here is a big trend that we see happening, I think everyone sees happening, is operators need the flexibility to find the business models that are going to support the ongoing investments we need to upgrade the networks to support this type of video. And apart from video, there's something else going on with the networks, and they are changing at their core. So my second trend is software-defined networks, and I think this is somewhat underappreciated, or at least underappreciated in the regulatory arena, but this is a major transformation of the networks. We are moving away from a network of telecom-specific hardware to one defined by software. So earlier, Cornelia Kuderer from Microsoft had mentioned that now every company is a software company, and that's true, including your telecom companies. Today, about 5% of our traffic is running over software-defined infrastructure. We hope that'll be up to 75% by 2020. So this is enormously innovative. It may go underappreciated, but it will allow for far greater responsiveness to customer needs and far faster deployment of new services. So this is a story about innovation and investment in the network at the core. It's not just innovation at the edge that lots of people, especially in the regulatory arena, credit and recognize, but this is innovation at the core. It also is significant because it confirms the further blurring of lines between traditional telecom operators and edge providers or over-the-top providers, whatever you may call them. Our network, and I would guess, for instance, Google's network, is increasingly looking alike as we deploy software-defined networking. And policies that treat them differently are going to look increasingly strained. Then the third issue I have to mention, though I won't spend a lot of time on it since the earlier panel did a phenomenal job with it, is the industrial internet or IoT or M2M. Here, what I will say is it's an area where we need to be particularly mindful of not allowing old rules or inapplicable rules just to hold us back. It's particularly true with those devices that will require a SIM or wide area connectivity. So I agree with Dr. Pepper's statements that many of these devices will not have a SIM at all. They will connect regardless, and they will connect over short distances. But there are many applications where you are going to want to connect devices over the commercial mobile network. These networks require fairly large investments just to interface, the platforms to interface with customers. There are huge economies of scale, and it could be costly for customers if they don't have seamlessness globally on these platforms. And the most efficient way to operate these devices is to operate them seamlessly across national boundaries, to build, distribute, and then operate. So a good example we talked a little about earlier is the traditional numbering systems, and they don't really apply in this context. These are used differently. And the point I want to make is that if there are substantive regulatory rules, like a privacy rule, that applies, it should apply, but those rules are separate from how you operationally enable these devices and deploy them, and we should be looking for the most efficient operational way to do that. And then the last trend I wanted to mention is 5G. There's so much interest in this, it has to be mentioned, but it remains nascent, right? It's clear its capabilities will significantly increase speed and capacity, and it will support IoT perhaps more than anything else. I think it will do so over licensed spectrum, over shared spectrum, over unlicensed spectrum, and it would depend on the device and function, how it's used and how it's provisioned. We're going to invest in 5G. I think the whole industry will invest in 5G because customers expect us to. They will move if we can't support the capabilities they're looking for. But public policy and regulation will matter in the deployment of 5G services. For instance, we'll need additional spectrum, as I say, both licensed and unlicensed and shared, both below 6 gigahertz and probably above 6 gigahertz as well. Providing services on spectrum that has no technology limits, and any use can be made of the spectrum is a way to foster innovation and investment in it. And we should try to avoid regulatory limitations that disincent investment in the spectrum. You've heard this before from AT&T. So for instance, short spectrum terms without a renewal expectancy means who's going to invest heavily in a 10-year license if in year 8, if at the end of 10 years you may no longer have that license. So long terms or renewal expectancies are critical to keep the investment flowing into spectrum. And then, of course, as I've said before, the need to operate commercially, to have the commercial flexibility to find returns on new and innovative technology is critical to making the judgment to make the investment. Now, my last slide, which, worry not, I will not discuss, is a list of regulatory issues, and these were just some things that come to mind. It's really not a comprehensive list, but when you start to think about this next evolution or revolution in the industry and the ecosystem, what are some of the things that are implicated? The one thing I'll mention, just to underscore a point, and it probably is not an issue in Europe, but then I think it makes it a little easier to see the point I'm trying to make, is the last point, global SIM, and I have a number of issues under there. Numbering we've talked about, regulations an issue. But this issue of taxation. There are some countries in the world that, based on a voice telephone model, have imposed a tax, a per SIM tax. The problem with IoT is if you're using a SIM, you're obliged to pay that tax, but often the revenue earned is so small it doesn't make it economic. So we have a customer who builds tractors, they're connected tractors, they get shipped around the world, and at least one country they've gone into has a per sim tax. So what's the answer? They've turned off the connectivity. That's not a good answer, right? That's a failure on the part of the industry and policymakers and the like. Now, I think we'll get that worked out, but there is a period of time where this capability is just not available because there's a tax law that may be perfectly sensible when applied to a voice model that really doesn't fit the new world we're entering of IoT. So the reason I highlight that of all these lists here is not because it's a pending issue here, but because it highlights how an old regulation that might be a good regulation, an old rule, applied in this context could just have unforeseen consequences and be negative. So those are the points I wanted to make as an upfront. I look forward to the conversation, and thank you again for having me.
What is dual regulation?
Oh, dual regulation. So here's a great example, and it's
I could read in Fatima's eyes that she didn't get that one.
So think of the health vertical, where you have healthcare.
Yeah.
So you may have your telecommunications regulator as well as the FDA regulating. Or think of privacy in the US, we have this odd situation where you have the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC. You could look at connected cars where you have Department of Transportation, NHTSA on the one hand and the FCC. Now, I'm not saying each does not have a role, but what you end up doing is creating enormous cost, operational cost, administrative cost, and sometimes inconsistencies. So the point of dual regulation is to eliminate it wherever possible, right? So that was the point on dual regulation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you.
Thank you also for providing competition to BEREC with an alternative work program for next year. Right? That's what your last slide looked like. Carlo, do you want to go next for a view of some examples of Google partnership or relationship with other players in the galaxy?
I think we had over the years, we saw some trends taking more importance. And the trend we see now is that thanks to the fact we all have those smartphones in our pocket and applications can be developed with them, we feel at Google that the frontiers within industries are sort of blurring. This is an example of a partnership we are doing with Sanofi. The idea of that is if you measure with a soft contact lens the level of glucosium that you have, and if you measure certain parameters of the life we make every day, and then Sanofi provides protocols and provides cure or provides drugs or whatever has to be provided according to the situation, well, what happens is that we can do, or they can do, or together we can not only maybe save lives, but provide services and things that are of certain importance. Now, if you think about this, how to bring that to market, what will be the role of the telcos? We believe that telcos dispose of unique characteristics for which they can be at the center of this economy of blurring of sectors. They have trust of the consumers. They have networks, of course, which can allow good quality of connectivity. They have call centers. They have billing, and I only mentioned a few. And I personally am convinced that what's happening today in health, and this is the case of diabetes, is happening also in banking, will happen in automotive, in many sectors. And this is a new potential for the economy, but maybe also something interesting for regulators as well, because it changes somehow the rules of the games we are playing, or maybe it changes the game we are playing, and it can be value creating for the economy in terms of creating jobs and possibilities. This is another example. I'll go very quickly on this, but this is the example of a woman who wants to, or a ballerina, she wants to dance, but she hasn't got doctors where she is. And by using connectivity and by using protocols and having a sensor on her feet, she can progress and study. Those kind of services are being created day after day. In the cars, this is on Android. We've got 30 now manufacturers and producers of components working with us with Android Auto to provide services to consumers. Now, if you think about it, we all enter the car with our phone, and yes, we could theoretically in a car with our phone do certain things. But if the phone is embedded into the car equipment, and if the information flows properly, and if the ergonomy is good, safety, security, ease of use, All that works in a different way. And as we all know, when all that components are together, the consequence is new services are born. Apple did not invent the iPod. Apple made a better iPod than before. It was easy to use and everybody adopted it finally. But so I imagine this is important. But if you tell us now, is the car sector entering telcos? Are telcos entering the car sector? Is internet or Google entering both sectors? Is it a new sector? Honestly, it's difficult to answer those questions. The reality is it's a service that requires the work of many different people. Just to take another example, I received one of my biggest bills from a telco the other day because I have a tracker in my car. And Vodafone sends me a bill every year to pay the tracker of my car. Well, the cost of insurance is low, and I received the other day an offer proposal from my insurance to have a certain service that seems to be competitive, and should I take the insurance one or the telco one? But when a telco offers it to me, is it telco, and when insurance offers it to me, it's insurance? Well, it's still a telco service somehow, because it's sort of, I think it's interesting to discuss about those complexities somehow. Smart cities, this is a dream, Who doesn't dream leaving Paris or Brussels as well, or London, or everywhere you live, to find your parking lot? Easily, or who doesn't dream somehow to know where he wants to go in a city, if there is traffic or not, and change the route. Make GPSs modern, make those services work, make traffic in cities improve. All that are issues that are economically very important and fundamental. But they require work of different people together. Again, the telcos, but maybe us as well, and then probably people in the cities, and then we have to respect the privacy, and it's so important. But if we don't make those industries blur, somehow progress would be limited. And the app economy, I was not believing the numbers when I saw that, because honestly, I didn't believe the app economy would have been more important than the internet economy, grow faster than the internet economy, and have more potential. But if I think to Europe now, and we are often asked to think about Europe, because we are a multinational, but we need to be local in the markets we are in. I think it's the biggest opportunity for growth of jobs in the next 4 years is the app economy. Today, the app economy in Europe is about 17 billion. It's about 1.3, 1.4 million people directly developing apps. It's expected to be, depending on whose consultant you ask, but it's expected to be between $60 to $80 billion within 4 to 5 years, so within 2020. And obviously, the number of jobs will be multiplied by proportion. So, don't know, new 4 million jobs, new 3.5, new 5 million, new a lot. Creating those jobs will require competences which are not only competences of telcos, nor of the internet, nor of specific services, because what happens is that apps are developed in every sector. So in pharmaceuticals, in banking, in retail, in any sector of life. So it's a mixture of skills that comes from software, technology, understanding the economics of a network, of course, because all that is important, but also comes from each and every sector. And who will actually bring those apps to market is something we don't really know. I would assume, and I would also hope, that telcos do it, because they are in position to bring that faster to market, maybe than other people. And maybe that creates also a way that the economy gets more balanced and jobs are created more everywhere. But this is something that will depend also of. And the third one element, and then I finished, is the element on pace of innovation. We are often asked, why do we move constantly? But I would just like to give you two numbers, which to me are striking, working for Google. In July of this year, if I'm not wrong, look at my colleagues, July, we discovered in July that searches today happen more in the 10 biggest countries in the world on a mobile phone than a PC. And we are still there. But it's an important change, because people on a mobile phone search in a different way. They don't look for the same things in the same way at the same moment, don't expect the same economy, and this is a big change. So we have to adapt our service to that if we want to still be alive. The second element is today, in the US, and it was announced today by the Financial Times, if I'm not mistaken, people don't Google anymore for products. They Amazon for products. If you look for a product in the US, I don't have calculations for the other countries, but I know that myself, I don't Google when I want for a product, I Amazon in France. And so those are changes, and I think there is a gap between what people think of companies and how people perceive companies and what they are in reality when the situation is. So a company like ours and many OTTs are obliged to move very fast and change because their environment evolves so fast and people react in certain ways, and services that are important one day get less important the other because something better somehow occurred. So changes happens very fast, and today I think we go from a world where we try to push information to people, from people asking questions to pushing information to people more, by creating services that will answer to it, like the cards that you see on Google now, where people can decide, when they are at the airport, which route to choose because they get proposals from the phone, or the phone prints you the boarding pass and things like this. So the pace of innovation is continuing to accelerate and is challenging for everybody because you get challenged by the changes of what the people do, like Google has recently been and will continue to be. The last one is the jobs. I don't want to talk about Google, so I will not spend time on making advertisement for Google. But what I want to say is I think we all share if I may, respectfully, all share a common responsibility, which is, depending on how we will look at all those issues of regulation on one side, of enabling innovation on the other side as maximum possible, of allowing this blurring of sectors, which, whether we like it or not, is happening around the world, well, will create a different opportunities for jobs. Today, we know at Google that out of the 3 to 4 million, and honestly, I don't know if it's 3 or 4 million jobs that will be created until 2020 for the app economy I was mentioning, we don't have the skills in Europe. It doesn't require skills of engineers with studies, it requires specific skills to develop those kind of things. So we decided to launch a program to form 1 million people to those technologies by end of 2016, and we are doing this with governments, with others. But what I'm trying to say here is, I often hear that the internet economy, and it includes telco and us and everybody, creates or destroys jobs. If I have to say it in a second, to me, the internet economy is an incredible opportunity to create for people an ability to get access to information and to wealth and to growth in ways that were not possible before. So the value is evident. And the creation of jobs is present, maybe not always where they are destroyed by the advancements. So our responsibility is to create, I think, together an economy where those jobs can be created everywhere, where it's possible to facilitate the creation of new services, and where all the people in the value chain respect the rules of the game, but can exert a role which is competitive and allows the growth of the economy we all want to grow, because the people in our economies depend from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. Now, I don't know how you feel, but I find suddenly our sector much more interesting than when we were spending days discussing mobile termination rates. The drawback is that the market definition will be much more challenging, than termination on individual networks. But Jan, shall we turn over to you? Yes. So Jan Farry is head of standardization at Ericsson. And of course, to state the obvious, standards and interfaces will be key to linking all these many elements in the new digital ecosystem. Jan.
So, thank you very much for inviting me. Now the slides disappeared, but yes, they will suddenly come back. Before I start my presentation, I would like to say that give a few examples of what is important. And during my presentation, I will also say something about what has made our industry flourish so very well the last couple of 15 years. And those things have been important and will be important also in the future. But there are differences going forward here. 3 fundamental things is really important when we are talking about driving an industry forward. And that is innovation, experiment, and competition. And I think these are 3 ground pillars which we have to have in mind when going forward. And whatever regulation we will have in the future, I hope, and it's our desire, that it will support those 3 pillars: innovation, experiment, and competition. Some examples of this when we are talking about, or some means that would be possible to utilize going forward in that sense, is that looking at the digital single market, we think that there should be a light touch approach. That's our desire. And we must have in mind that the world is changing, and we have to be adaptive and able to change things going further. One fundamental thing for an industry to flourish is that we will have widespread adoption of technology and systems, and regulation should not point to a certain technology direction. That's very important for us. And of course, if we would like to look at our industry, ICT, infrastructure and broadband, stimulation is of course important for us as such. Having that in mind now, when we're looking at the mobile industry and what have happened so far, we have made some prediction and have some numbers shown on this slide. It's not really important about the specific figures here, but even though we have had a great and tremendous growth in the mobile industry, there is still more growth to come. And looking at the mobile broadband subscriptions, which are now on top of the agenda, they will grow even the next coming 5 years. And the mobile traffic, as we have heard before, and the fixed traffic will also increase going further. And that, of course, give demands on our current network as well as future networks. One thing with mobile telephony or mobile broadband is that, of course, you would like to access this wherever you are. And looking at it today and in the next coming 5 years, we will nearly have all the world's population covered by either GSM, wideband CDMA systems or LTE systems. And that is a great achievement, I would say. One more thing about history here. If we look at what have happened the last 25 years, when GSM started in 1992, it took approximately 10 years before we had reached 1 billion subscribers in those networks. Going even further back, it took 100 years to connect 1 billion subscribers in the fixed networks. But looking from approximately 2010, we have added on 5 billion users in our mobile systems, and we expect now that we are entering a world where even more devices, up to 25 or 30 or 100 billion devices, will be connected to the networks on a global base. And that, of course, is really giving us some opportunities, but of course also challenges. And as I will point out later on, even though it's shown here that 70% of the mobile terminals will be smartphones, there will be devices which are not that smart, as was mentioned earlier this morning as well. So now we have talked about, or I have talked a little bit about 2G, 3G and 4G. What's really different now when we are entering and talking about 5G? It is that there will be new use cases which we have not so far had in our systems. And maybe some of the use cases are already there to some extent, but when we are now entering 5G and going further within our industry, we would like to, or I think it's inevitable that we will address new industries and getting them into our network. So that puts really some different requirements on our network in the future. And here are some examples, and they have been shown before, so I will not dwell on that. But think about different requirements for different industries. That's the key point here. And we must build our networks flexible and adaptable in the future. And even though we are talking a lot about wireless systems here, 2G, 3G, 4G and 5G, I mean 5G is not only about the wireless access or the mobile systems. It covers everything from transport, access, cloud infrastructure, new applications and management of the systems. And including already from the beginning such things as security and defining network for a sustainable world. So it's not only radio access. Standardization will not only happen in 3GPP, it will be in many other different standardization for us, defining the network as well as management. So that's a new picture which we have to deal with going further here. So a little bit about the requirements here. The details here are not of importance, but it was mentioned this morning as well that it's a variety of requirements that we have to cover. If we are talking about connected sensors, I mean, they should not be charged. They should be very cheap and have good coverage, of course, but also they don't transmit very much data very often. If you then look at the critical communication or machine-type communication, where you need instant responses, very high speeds, and very high data rates, they're totally different use cases. So if you don't build a network which can comply with these different requirements in an efficient way, we cannot serve these different use cases. So that's very important to have in mind, flexibility. Both on the network side, but also on the services side, that we can introduce applications and services up to year 2030, and applications and services we are not aware of today. We have to build those kind of networks going further here. And this is a picture which we have drawn to really show on high level how this will work. We will have different use cases, different industries connected to different clouds. We will have a high-performing network in between, which then must be flexible enough to serve these different industries, as well as provide the right requirements at the right time. And you have to be able to do this on quite short notice. We cannot set up these pipes or build this different network for different industries on year-time basis. These slices, as we call them, should be able to be allocated on millisecond basis and provide the right quality of service for different applications and services and industries at the right time instant. So that's a key thing going forward. So, as a summary, I pointed out a few things here, which is that the performance of the network will be very important. They must be programmable so that we can adjust them to the different circumstances or the different requirements that are needed at different times. Media services are already now entering our networks, and they will produce more data. So performance and providing capacity in our networks will be key going forward. And given all these capabilities, and the flexibility will of course open up for new businesses, new business models which we have to cater for. And security and privacy are things that will be very important. At last but not least, I mean, in order to run a mobile network or a wireless network, we need spectrum. And that is a scarce resource, as you know. It's already today filling up the spectrum below 6 gigahertz, and for 5 gigahertz, as mentioned before, we are looking at higher frequencies, higher bandwidths, and ways to actually, on a dynamic base, allocate frequencies, both in terms of where in the spectrum we run the services, as well as how much bandwidth we use at the different time instances. So with that, I will end my presentation and be here for the debate or discussion.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this. We'll come back to standards in a minute. Before that, we will listen to Jan. I think we heard 3 very interesting presentations: the public policy angle, the business angle, the standardization angle. All these were really comfortable for BEREC to listen to. This one might be different.
No, I don't know.
Nothing.
So thank you first for the invitation. And my task was given to me by Tom Boyce. He said, please, the OTT paper. He sent me this long paper, and I said, oh, come on, I will check the paper in a typical Germanic approach, which means critical. But first, to say really an honest sentence, the quality of these papers are marvelous. Highly sophisticated papers. I have read several of them and checked them, and they are really, really high quality. So that's the starting point.
That's not what you promised. That's
not what you promised. Come to the point.
This is not in the script.
Okay. That was a good skip for me, because I want to tell you a story of a German law professor whose name was called Puchter. And he had the idea in the 18th century to build up a universe of definitions. He called it Begriffsjurisprudenz, and he had the vision of everything is just if it's part of a definition. So, reading this paper of the OTT, I've used my spelling program, and it said 56 times the word definition is integrated in that paper. So that brings me to a point. Does it help to start with definitions? It doesn't help at all. And I am in fear to say to you all, the whole discussion whether ECS is defined as and how, and that doesn't help at all. The question is not whether OTT is ECS under the condition, under the definition of so-and-so. The question is, should it be an ECS? That means the question of the consequences. Of course, checking the OTT paper, I've seen other normative models, that is the federal term, normative models. One is called proportionality. Wow, it's difficult to pronounce. To be proportionate. So this sounds to be a striking, kind of really normative model, not the old Puchta system of definitions. But what does proportionate mean? It's a very old term of public law, which is used by people coming from the public law area to say, I have a certain aim, a fixed aim, and all the steps to come to that aim have to be proportionate. So, but that doesn't help at all, because we don't know whether the aim, the end success, should be like it is. So it is a typical model of public law regulators, but it's not very helpful at all. So then we have the term equivalence. OTT should be regulated under ECF if they are perhaps equivalent to an ECS. But what does equivalent mean? Is it meant to be on the technical equivalence? No, of course not. There is some normative model behind that, but that's not expressed in the paper. So because it's not explained. And then there are other words like objectivity. Nobody knows what that is. We all hope to be objective, of course. So nobody knows it. And then there is some small reference, only a sentence, saying that proportionate might be something which has to do with social cost. And that brings me to the point. Because you can only be normative if you stick to the rules of Philip Heck. Perhaps you have heard about Philip Heck, a very old lawyer from the 1920s, who was the first one to attack Puchta. He established a new word called Interessenjurisprudence. He said law always has to do with interest. We have to define whether the interest is legitimate, and then we can apply modern tools to define how we balance these legitimate interests. So that brings me to the point. I don't see too much of legitimate interest mentioned in that paper. There is some small reference to consumer protection, a little bit wordings like competition. But whatever is happening with innovation, everything my three predecessors has told about new markets and whatever. And the most striking point is, it is missing a whole analysis coming from an economic point. We need to combine law and economics, and that can be done. It is mentioned in this one sentence of social costs and whatever, but it's not done in the whole study. So it should be there, especially in these new markets. So the effect on the new market have to be checked. And the other striking point of the paper, I wonder who has really read this paper, only to give you a really rough summary. It has 3 categories, saying there is OTT 0, OTT 1, and OTT 2. OTT 0 are not a problem at all, because that are the OTTs we have to do with telephone. It's old-fashioned telephone. OTT 2 are not a problem either, because they are mentioned as being not ECS. So there is a category in the middle, which is OTTs which are not ECS, but which might compete with ECS. Now I'm coming to another bad story. Well, if you're talking about competition, and there's a lot of reference to competition, you should know more about markets. I just destroyed a young researcher at my institute. He has written a 600-page study on the question of Google and markets, of market definitions regarding Google. He was killed. He came to the result that he has no result at all. He couldn't find a real market definition for all these new age instruments like Google or Facebook. So if you're talking about competition of OTT1, what do you mean with compete and with markets? And I would really want to make you frightened now. Who are you as national regulators to talk about competition and markets? There are other guys who can do it better. That is, of course, competition authorities. And they have the power, they have economists, and they should do the job, in my understanding. I know, I hear the whoa, okay, I'm killed afterwards. Coming to the point at the end, and it's not only the end, What I liked with the paper is, of course, the summary regarding the need for a reform. Because there are two tools mentioned which I like very much. One is my favorite wording, it's still too soon. That's what I like, still too soon, because non-regulation, a moratorium as Bill Clinton has done in 2000, that's great for new technologies. Don't regulate if there is no need to regulate. In dubio pro libertate, how the old Romans have said it, in doubt for liberty. And the other thing is to deregulate, but that is my most shocking sentence in the whole study. There is a page 26 where it said, somebody said, what is happening if we are double regulating things? So we have a normal regulation, perhaps in civil law, and a regulation in telecommunications law as well. And then there was like a kind of strange humor. The author said, the extra burden of sector-specific rules seems to be limited. Then it's okay. So, you see the cost argument, we can have triple regulation. It doesn't matter at all. If the social costs are, what is called, limited, the collateral damage, then everything is fine. So that is not, of course, a solution for deregulation. What we need to understand is that we have to deal carefully with these new markets. And that leads, again to my last shock, to a new understanding of NRAs. If we have a situation where M2M communication, my favorite topic this morning, is not regulated under telecommunication law, and if we have a situation where most of the OTTs are not regulated by telecommunication law, then of course a national regulation authority is losing importance. That's frightening. You are not national regulation authorities anymore, but you will change and transmute to become what I call an NCA, a National Consulting Authority. That's good, but that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Thomas, for living up to your reputation. I'm not sure you will be invited next year. At least you helped me keeping this audience awake. Thank you very much. For the debate, I was thinking, to try to have a bit of a structured debate, that we could first discuss business and then move gently towards perhaps more regulatory legal issues, and perhaps picking up on Carlo's presentation, where he had some very kind words. You had some very kind words about telcos. Telcos have a billing relationship. They have a brand that consumers love. My friend Guillermo is left, so I can say that. Anyway, all the characteristics of telco can now be leveraged, not just to sell telephony, but to do bright things in the world. So I like that bit very much. And I was wondering whether Len buys this message. Do you think, Len, that in this brave new world, telcos will be able to strike deal with other partners in the ICT value chain and be able to sell much more than data and voice? Len, what do you?
I think I would frame it differently. I think rather than talk about partnerships, I think the companies we refer to as over-the-top companies are just essential. It truly is an ecosystem, and this is why I think the view of openness and whether ISPs support openness or not is misplaced. Because if you don't support openness, you're killing your own business, right? So there is a partnership in the sense that we build these massive networks to carry a lot of data, but if you're not giving customers access to the data they want, what good are the networks? So I think there is a virtuous circle here. I think there is value, whether there's explicit partnerships, maybe possible in the future. But I think the key here is you want to be open so you're carrying any traffic customers want and driving value over the network.
Yeah. Carlo, you gave fascinating examples of the relationship you have with other players, other companies. You at Google, do you engage actively in partnership with telcos as of today?
We try.
You try. And what are the main problems that you encounter?
Well, I think the first point is trust, stability of the relationship, and stability of conditions over time. And part of the issue with the services that we talk about, whether they are those automotive ones or any app, is that the business models are in constructions while we start and while we want to partner. So the trust is difficult to build because of this instability that is inherent in that economy. The second element, I think, is, it was told me by the president of a telco operator some weeks ago. He told me, the difference between the telcos and the OTTs is that the OTTs are led by product people in general, and the telcos are led by managers, and the product people are below in the organization. I think it's an interesting example, because I don't know if it's always true, but what does it tell me? It tells me that you need to dialogue between people that understand each other, and that understanding is not always that easy to build. Now, third element, and why I think that we will see it happening in the next months as more and more, is that if we want to bring those services to the market, whether it's us or other industries, and do it fast, nobody has a relationship with customers in big numbers and with trust as the telcos have. It's not to be nice, it's a fact of life. So I hope that in your role of regulators, if I may, you'll think about the importance for the telcos to be free to compete in this new ecosystem, in a way that when they are on the services, they can compete with us, but also partner with us, or compete with us, or partner with other people in the industry. Because this fact of the blurring of the frontiers between sectors will be a big, big change in the economy. Honestly, I don't know what pharmaceutical sector, there will have to be rules for that, of course, but, pharmacy blurring with cars, with everything, and telcos need to be free to participate to that economy and bring what they have without having to look down, but with the ability to look up at the services and not only at the network.
Len, do you agree that the main obstacles to telcos cooperating with OTTs is a cultural problem? Your product guys at AT&T should be promoted?
No, I think, I think, at least speaking for my own company, I think we're very forward-looking and creative. I think you just look at the connected car environment and IoT, where we really have led the way. But I do appreciate Carlos' comments that I think it's important for all the players in the system, particularly as the lines merge, to have freedom to innovate, to find ventures and partnerships and other opportunities to bring value to consumers. And it's very difficult to do that. If you're in a mother may I environment, or you're constrained in your opportunities by regulation ex ante, it's very hard to find that, and therefore it's very hard to invest, because you look at the market and say, am I going to earn a return? In the current environment, with rapid change in technology, the dynamism we see, having the ability to go out and explore business opportunities is just critical. And there's always the opportunity, if anything's done that we find harms consumers, the competition authorities, or otherwise, there's always an opportunity to ensure there are no abuses. But to have upfront rules that limit innovation, limit the ability of any player in these markets, who all bring different strengths, so I agree there as well, it just slows innovation. And it goes to the point that, are we going to continue to see the aggressive growth of this ecosystem?
Carlo, I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room from time to time who is to explain the concept of, or try to, of specialized services. And then when you do that, say, oh yeah, Philip, that's the latest thing that telcos have found to make more money. Say, no, it's not just that, it's really critical for society. We will need specialized services for critical application. And then, apart from IPTV, it's not always easy to find a good one. So, Carlo, I always dream of meeting a high-level guy at Google to ask the following question. Will Google buy specialized services to help with the driverless car? Because surely you cannot rely on sensors, you need high-quality telecom networks, and so for my next presentation on specialized services, I can say, we need specialized services, because if you dream of driving a Google car, you will need these services in your country. Can I use that example?
Of course. Well, we have freedom of expression is the minimum we can.
No, but I need to be based on facts, so at least.
I would like, on one side, to go back to the professor here. Definitions may have different meanings for different people in different environments. So to me, it is clear, something is very clear. We will not build a driverless car. It will be built by manufacturers. The driverless car will require, for all the people operating around it, to provide services, to provide skills that are not traditional for them, but are new. Mm-hmm. And telco operators, in that sense, will have a different role than the one they have today. Yeah. because it will not be only network provision, but it will be more. For us at Google, and on this I want to be very transparent, but also very clear, for us, the fact that information can be carried around networks, not respecting the freedom of the desires of the users and the freedom to choose whatever they want to have, is a very important principle for innovation, but also for respecting the customers. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what exactly we intend by this concept of specialized services, and I don't want to answer to something I don't fully understand.
Well, you like definition. Thank you.
No,
Thank
I think it's important to define it. I think it's important to be clear.
Thank you.
It's clear, however, that I hope and hope sincerely that telcos will be in position to provide something different than just the connectivity, and that the term of connectivity will change in situations where the world is evolving that fast.
Thank you. I think it's an excellent answer. Jan, from your perspective, you're a guy who travels to many standardization bodies, include on the telecom side, on the internet side. How do you see, I mean, you meet colleagues from both sides. What would you say are the main obstacles to telcos and OTTs cooperating more closely?
I think that there are no real obstacles, but they have not been forced to do that until, well, a couple of years ago. I think talking about standardization, first of all, I would like to say something about standardization from my point of view, because it means different things for different people. But for me, standardization from a technology point of side is to write a specification, actually, or agree on a specification. And that's the main purpose with standardization. Then we can do that in different ways. And in the telecom world, we have used ETSI and 3GPP. In the ICT world, one example is IETF, where you define the protocols. And also on the application side, we have worked together now to define open interfaces so that you really can write applications and introduce new services in the telecom networks. And I think that will continue. And we also see now that open source is another way to make standards, de facto standards, which we have to embrace in our industry and work together. So I think standardizations is a way to agree on a common specification in order to have scale in our systems. Mm-hmm. And talking about the number of subscribers in the mobile networks, where we have 7 billion subscribers today, that wouldn't have been possible without the standard. I mean, there wouldn't have been an ecosystem for terminals, there wouldn't have been an ecosystem for networks and globalized, harmonized frequencies. If they were not there, we wouldn't have a global system. So I think this is very important, that we agree on a common set of specifications, and then there are different means to come to that point. Yeah. But I think what we see now is that we're working more and more together in the different industry segments. So.
That's an encouraging message. Mm-hmm. Thomas, I wanted to ask you, when I, as a regulatory guy, try to think of why OTTs and telcos might go to bet together. I'm thinking, okay, OTTs, like perhaps we will see the Google driverless car, the OTTs may need to buy specialized services because they need a higher quality. Sometimes telcos may wish to offer content for free to differentiate their product. Usually we call that zero rating. My question to you is, do you think we've got all the legal concept we need, like specialized services, zero rating, others that you may have in mind, to actually understand, and for lawyers in the room to advise their clients on this relationship between telcos and OTTs? Do we have the toolkit, the legal toolkit, is it complete?
Yeah, to tell you that, we accompanied several projects by big European car producers. You can understand who. There are not too many. And we checked them from a research perspective, only just to understand what is happening in the project. And to mention 3 items. The one is, I think the culture that was already mentioned is totally different if you take an OTT and a telecom operator. And it has to do with the rank of regulation. An OTT has a general feeling, I'm free. I have nothing to do, of course, I shouldn't bother and fight against the competition law authorities, but that is still an open question, but they are free. Freedom of internet, everything is free. A telecom operator is coming from a totally different angle, at least in Europe. He's coming from a big fear that everything which he's doing is within a strict corset of rules. So that causes the second item, of course. In this kind of project, we noticed a big fear who is responsible for what. So who is responsible for taking care for all these telecom regulations? If you have a Volkswagen, I would like to avoid this name, but I think I have to do it. Within a Volkswagen, who is responsible for these SIM cards in this moment, for all these telecommunications supplier for that? That is not regulated. Of course, Volkswagen said that should be done by the AT&Ts of the world. And AT&T said, we are American, there's another problem, so let us help, let us use big lawyers, law companies, and that's all. So and the third item that relates to your question is the problem of market. If we have zero content, of course, with zero. I remembered I was with students visiting Google Germany in Hamburg. And we had a lovely 2 days, good lectures, everything was fine. But there was one topic where we were really in controversy with the Google guys that were, of course, competition law issues. Because they always said, Thomas, we are not competition law players at all. We are giving everything for free. So there is no market. So we are not talking about markets. So take your zero approach, of course, distributing things for free is regarded by some of these players as causing not any market disturbance at all.
Not by BEREC.
And you see the problem, we need to find new market models so that even Google can understand that they are not giving things for free, but there's a lot of economic impact involved in that.
I think Google agrees with that.
Today,
I don't know who you spoke to, but I think we feel that clear. No, if I may, I would like to contradict a bit, one or two elements of what you said. This absolute freedom doesn't exist because we are all bound to something that's called the customer. And the responsibility versus customers is fundamental because with no trust there is no service. So I don't think we can say OTT feel they're completely free. OTT have an advantage versus maybe people that have a past is that they can create services from scratch. This is true. Yeah. So creating a service from scratch, I don't have the burden of a process and eventually the cost associated with that process. We can rethink from scratch, but we have the obligation to think customer-oriented, otherwise it doesn't work, and to put the value of the service before the business model. In that sense, I agree with what was told to you in Hamburg. We think money after the value of the service. So we'll think, am I providing value, and then how much money will I make? Whether in economy, and in particular in Europe, we've been taught by schools to do the contrary. You do a business plan, you do the revenue first and then the cost. This inversion of the mechanism mentality is an important one. Now, that people at Google don't think that they're responsible for what they do because their services are free is honestly shocking to me. And if they did so, I apologize to you for that, because it's insulting. Yeah. And I hope they didn't mean that, because it is insulting. Many media have a situation where the revenue is made in a different part, but we can't say that because it's free, it's not. No, that doesn't make absolutely no sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
No,
yeah. Several speakers mentioned 5G, and 5G on the wireless side is a bit the backbone for this Internet of Things that we discussed this morning. And one question which I can't resist, and it's also addressed to you, Jan, because we had a great seminar by Ericsson on 5G, absolutely fantastic. I'm sure many of you attended it. But one question which was not really addressed is whether the positive impact of society of 5G was very well made. And again, today it was clear from your presentation. What is not clear to me is whether European operators, or perhaps operators around the world, but let's stick to Europe, will invest in 5G for fear that if they don't, as you said, Len yourself, if we don't invest in 5G, Verizon will, and we will lose customers, which is one reason to invest, and a good one. Now, I'm old enough to remember when operators invested in 2G, where it wasn't a question of we invested there because we were going to make a lot of money, So is the 5G story only a question of if we don't invest, we will lose? Or is there a good news in 5G for the industry? Like we will invest, and there is a brighter future than with 4G. Who wants to tackle that? I mean, you may say, Jan, I'm selling the boxes, it's up to these guys to sell them. So maybe you can pass it on to them.
But if I just give in my perspective, I think we can do a lot with the systems we have out there today, but then there will be just linearly improving the performance, and we have the mobile broadband pipe there everywhere on a global base. But as I mentioned earlier, in order to perhaps grow the business and see additional growth, we have to address other industries using our networks, and then we have to do some refinements and fulfilling new requirements. So that's why 5G is needed.
And I think the new requirements are positive. So I think there's a reason to invest that's positive. The flip side of the coin is if you don't, consumers will find value in other carriers who do. One of the things that worries me about 5G, I think the industry, the standards bodies are on target to deliver 5G. It's moving along, and what worries me is when you start seeing governments starting to compete on the let's establish 5G standards or let's get ahead on 5G. I think the industry is going to get us there. I think there's need for education to make sure people understand we're headed in that direction. I think the government intervention around 5G will not speed introduction, but I think the regulatory issues around investing and opportunity to earn a return are far greater questions than is the industry on track to get to 5G? I think we will.
Len, while we are with you on investment for 5G, I remind Karim that he promised me a paper on investment for a few weeks now. But I was staggered the other day. I saw a paper comparing capex, telecom capex per capita in Europe and in the US over the last 15 years, or not just last year. And it was like a ratio roughly of 1 to 2, and I couldn't believe it. Are you so inefficient that you need to invest double that what we invest, or what is?
That's a good question. and I'll point out in answering the question, Europe used to lead in wireless, and now the U.S. does.
So why are you investing so much?
There are a number of factors, like anything else, right? So let me list 4 factors that I think are relevant, and then go in depth on one. One is competition, genuine facilities-based, no-holds-barred competition. The regulatorily contrived resale competition won't necessarily drive investment. It's like walking a tightrope without a net for a whole host of reasons. But true competition drives investment. It also drives lower prices. They're not inconsistent ideas, right? So one is competition. We talked about spectrum and the way spectrum is allocated in the U.S. The FCC has authority nationwide, so you have more consistency across the country. And also we have renewal expectancies, which is absolutely critical. So you have a spectrum pipeline and renewal expectancy, so you keep investing in that spectrum because it's your asset. I'm going to mention tax policy, though I'm no tax expert, but we all know that tax rates and depreciation have an effect on investment and capital deployment. But the fourth one I've mentioned before, and I want to go into just a moment of detail, and that's this idea of light touch regulation. It sounds like a talking point, but it's really critical to understand how regulation, even inadvertently, suppresses investment. I think the point's about sort of a regulatory overhang, and now the mindset is, well, one, I have to check. I'm just not free to deploy a service that my customers, I think, want, but does it comport with these regulatory requirements? There's that issue. Regulation necessarily imposes cost. It could distort a playing field, so it distorts competition. Now I'm trying to make a bet on a new technology, investing risk capital, and I'm not sure I'm going to have the opportunity to earn a return. And sometimes regulation, by its nature, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, will preclude an entity like a telco from entering certain markets or trying certain service offerings, and that reduces prospects. So, and then you have just regulation takes time. And, the internet moves quickly. You have to act quickly, and regulation can't. So it's not saying no regulation. I don't want to be heard to say that. I think there's a role for regulation, especially consumer protection regulation. But it should be applied uniformly. It should be applied without regard to technology or operator. And I think it should be bottoms up. We're in a new world today. What are our policy objectives? Can we apply them? Who do you have to apply them to without regard to old categories? I know that's difficult given regulators were designed to regulate telcos. But I think that's another thing. So 15 years ago, in that time frame roughly, the U.S. made a very bold but considered decision to deregulate advanced services. There's been a flood of investment. I think that was very crucial. Now we're in a period of uncertainty. We have new rules that look a lot more like utility regulation. What does that mean? Are there going to be mother may I's? Will we, although the regulator says no, be pulled into rate regulation because they invite complaints, and what are complaints and how you resolve them? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now in the U.S. We want to see the growth we've seen over the last 15 years continue. So a long story, four elements of a recipe that I think drive investment that I think have been very strong in the U.S., maybe less so here, and that might explain the difference.
Thank you. Carlo, from a Google perspective, are you happy with the availability, quality of telecom networks in Europe, or would you dream as a European to have for Google in Europe the kind of networks you have in the States?
I think in Europe there are some things we have to state clearly. The level of competition among telcos, and the regulators have done a great job at that, is such that consumers are in position to purchase services and express their interest in those services in a very effective way. I mean, the prices on average are lower than in the US. And I think this is important because it creates a better situation for consumers. Now, it's true that the regulators regulated in Europe at the start, if I'm not wrong, because it was one of my first jobs. I was doing this accounting of verifying that the incumbent were not, were behaving properly with the last mile at the liberalization. This was a reason to create regulation, but I think the world in which we are in today is completely different. So from Google's perspective, I think it would be finding a way to look at the world not as it was 30 years ago, but as it is today, and say, what can be done to continue to move. A last element I would like to clarify, which is we always tend to think about investment, saying telcos, and imagining that the OTTs live in a sort of cloud that is free and that they don't have to invest for.
That's what I thought.
But the reality is we do carry our data on average to 90% of the road versus our customers ourselves, and if you look at our balance sheet, we invest probably the same percentage or even sometimes higher than telcos every year in creating data centers, So I think we should not forget that investments need to be promoted for everybody. I mean, you will not have this economy growing if there are no data centers, if there is no investment in software, if there is no investment in all the layers, and not only the telcos. I'm not saying telcos aren't important, they are fundamental. But if you want a proper service, you need right investment on telcos, but then you need also the right investments from the side of the OTTs and everybody. And it's just not true that the OTTs don't need to invest. So if you think about that as an ecosystem where everybody has to do his part, then I think the role of the regulator becomes, on one side, much more complex, but also, honestly, to create an environment that fosters investment and makes investment more easy, because our economy depends from that. And what we would love to see in Europe, I'm being very honest, is promotion of investment so that we see those jobs created, we see those economies moving, and we see ourselves not in a situation where the competitiveness of our continent gets lower than the one in the US or Asia because it's bad for our people.
Is Google going to become a telco? I mean, telcos complain that Google was not investing in networks, and then you fibered a few cities, and they say, look, Philip, now they're going to compete with us on our core business.
But apologies, investment doesn't mean fiber in cities. We invest in data centers. We've got 10 data centers in Europe. We invested in the last 2 years about 3 billion in Europe in data centers. And the data centers need to be connected, and we try to bring the information as close as possible to consumers so that the load on network is as low as possible, which is improving our relationship with the telcos. So again, there are many other investments that the cabling and the layer of networks that are necessary for that economy to work, and on that we do invest a lot.
And is it a debate in the States as well, this complaint OTTs are allegedly not investing or not?
No, but let me, if I may, I just want to make one point on the pricing issue, because I've been here this week and you hear a lot. It's taken for granted prices are cheaper in in Europe than they are in the US. And I think that's incorrect. There have been a range of studies. Now, I know you make a face, but there have been a range of studies, and it depends.
When we hear about you fools, it makes everybody in this room very jealous.
It depends on what you look at, what the speeds are. I think you'll see different price points at different speeds in the relative comparison. Professor Yu at University of Pennsylvania did a study on this not long ago. It also is hard to compare because in the US, at least last year, you're comparing LTE with 3G. So now you have a quality of service issue. When you look at broadband, a lot of the comparisons include video and what are the costs in the video, and are you including taxes or not taxes. When you get through it all, I don't think pricing is that different, and often you see it as less expensive in the US, but I think the value is critical. So if you look at what the consumer is getting value for the dollar, one simple measure is how many gigabits are consumed per person in a country or a region. And the two areas that consume the most gigabits per person is the United States and South Korea, as I recall. And that's a real measure of value. That's how you determine, is the industry delivering to consumers something of value that they're willing to purchase? So I just wanted to put that in context, that we shouldn't just assume pricing, but let's go look at it very carefully.
Then I agree with you. We should not confuse prices and ARPUs. These are different things. Thank you.
And on investment, I think there has been enormous investment in the U.S. Google has built some fiber networks, which they're welcome to do. In fact, in the U.S., in some cities, you could go to Austin now, and I think you have 2 or 3 fiber networks and a cable network competing against each other in certain areas of Austin today. It's not a question. I don't think the issue is you should look at any player in the industry and say, are you investing enough? Investment's important. It's jobs, it's growth. But the real issue is, do we have a policy framework that allows all providers to come and compete in the areas where they feel is appropriate to their business plan, and then investing and trying to make a living doing that? Or are there unnecessary constraints?
Yeah, thank you. Before we move to the second part of this debate, when people talk about the future of the telecom operators, there are often a contrast between 2 ridiculously extreme scenarios. Some telcos say we're going to become the pie providers, like the water company, minimal return on investment. And then, for example, our previous commissioner, Mrs. Cruz, was talking about when will one of you become the next Facebook, which is probably equally unrealistic. And I've often wondered, what is a realistic expectation, ambition, vocation for the average European telco? Being a pie provider, perhaps. I mean, why not? There are probably investors backing that. They do it for water. But what is a realistic expectation? You want to start?
Me?
Do you have an opinion, or do you want AT&T to start, and then you say whether it should high enough? And
we could have a European for Google talking about the European telcos, or an American telco talking about the European telcos.
Len, and then we'll have the others adding to that.
For me, as I mentioned, even our large purchase of DirecTV was more about connectivity, as much about connectivity as it was about pay TV. We are a broadband company, and we're proud of that. It's when you talk about pipes, it sounds bad, or it sounds like there's no future, but I disagree with that. But I do think there are things telcos bring to the market that are really compelling. Security is going to be absolutely critical going forward. The security of the service you use, we underscore that. We think that's a value add that telcos should be providing in their service offerings. And there are a variety of ways. We'll go into details about how that can be manifest. There are also other capabilities. Last night I was talking to Bob Pepper, and he was outlining in compelling fashion, and I think it echoed something Carlos said as well, which is telcos have millions and millions of customer relationships, and that capability in that relationship, the ability to build, the ability to track data and analyze data is enormous inside a telco. But it's impossible to sit here today, I think there was the quote earlier, and project the future. We don't know where the industry goes. But I do think the telcos in Europe, in the US, and around the globe have enormous assets, bring enormous strength to the marketplace, and bring enormous value to consumers and our economies. And we shouldn't sell them short or put them in a box. I worry about all this talk about utility. We're not utilities. IP networks are not electric pipes. They require a constant innovation and investment. And we should encourage that. We should encourage that for all the services you want to provide in the future. And we should be encouraging all the players in this industry to innovate without permission.
DLC need to become DSP. Distance service providers. Instead of TLC should become DSP. Distance service providers.
Distance service provider.
What they do, they provide service at distance. And they're in a unique position to provide service at distance. And I think this is a great opportunity in this new economy to look at it differently somehow. Instead of looking at themselves as TLC, look themselves as DSP. No, it's not a joke. I really do believe.
I like it. I'm just digesting information.
I do believe that this distance service provider
e-health
element.
services, e-education.
Yes. I mean, the telcos are. It's extremely difficult. Okay, let me take another example to clarify it. some months ago, Larry decided, and the board of Google decided to create Alphabet, and why did they do it? Because they thought if we stay and we control Google, we will be controlling our core business, which is the search, and search is getting less important because of Amazon and because of competition. And if we need to look at something different, we have the time to look at something different. So they say we create Alphabet and we change the perspective and look at something different. Telcos, if I may, in Europe, I hope that you can put them in a position to think differently and say, look, yeah, okay, the network is fundamental, connectivity is important, but I'm not a TLC, I'm a DSP, I need to provide services, so I need to be in position where I look at the market this way and exploit my skills and combine them differently with other players and make that happen.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Jan, you know this community of telcos very well for many years. Do you see them climbing up the value chain and moving into distance service providers? Or you think that should rather stick to closer to their knitting?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, service and application development within the telecom networks have been a little bit cumbersome. I mean, the application and end user services has been developed outside the telecom network. But I think when we are talking about now the future here, when we talking about programmable networks and support different services for different industry sectors, there will be new ways of looking at innovation and application and services. So, and there I think the regulation must allow them for the operator to play within that area. Otherwise, that will also be done outside.
And Jan, through your work in the various standardization bodies, you have got a good view of the whole ecosystem. And should telcos in this room move up the value chain in these new businesses, there might be sometimes the one facing bottlenecks. In the regulatory circles, so far the bottlenecks were on the telco side. Is telcos move in this brave new world? Do you expect them to face bottlenecks in terms of specific software, interfaces, content? I have no idea.
I think if you take the most obvious bottleneck is the availability of spectrum. I mean, for the mobile systems.
I was asking for something more radical. Let's leave spectrum. That's too easy, Jan. You should be a bit more daring.
That's too easy. But I think if we look back, and we have to take care of that also in the building the new standards here that I was talking about, flexibility. In order to actually evolve the networks and be open then for other industries, as I mentioned before. I mean, we have to build the system in a way that they can be upgraded, and that relies, put demands on our industry as standardizing things as well. So one hinder or one obstacle is that it takes sometimes too long to introduce a new service in a telecom system. So that's one thing which has been a hinder so far, but I think we have to be more flexible. That's important.
Yeah. Len, is a large operator wishing to prosper in this new digital ecosystem? What are the main bottlenecks that you expect to face, if any? Or is it just a rosy future? Everything is free market and
well, I think it may be too easy, but true. I think spectrum's a critical component. I am concerned about regulation. I do think, one of the points on the idea of moving to a software-defined network is to begin to really innovate quickly, provide service more quickly. It becomes far more challenging in some sense to provide service to customers, but you're providing things faster and better and more innovatively. So I don't know that there are roadblocks or bottlenecks. I do worry again about if you move to a position where you just view the networks as utilities, you essentially put them in a box. And given we don't know what the future holds, that box may not be adequate as a platform for innovation, right? And so the key here is the flexibility, and the inflexibility, my fear, coming from my perspective, could be regulation. We do need the inputs of spectrum, but those would be my concerns.
Mm-hmm. And also I think, there are different regulations in different countries, and when you're thinking about these new industries, health sector, car sector, utility sector, power plant sector, and things like that, then we have to look at what regulations are there to provide services to those sectors, and that might be, I mean, that's a challenge which we have to face.
And Philip, so over the last 6 years, AT&T invested $120 billion. One company, $120 billion. We've shown ourselves not afraid to invest, to go after opportunities. It's risk capital, you go after it, and what we need is the freedom to continue to do that.
Jan, in this debate on bottlenecks that we are sometimes having, I hear calls for regulators to take steps to ensure interoperability. And interoperability, in my sounds to me, I'm not an expert, but like mandatory standards. Jan, what do you think of mandatory standards? Is it something that is welcome in the standardization bodies that you
I don't think that mandatory is the right word, but as I said, we have to be able to operate on a global base, or even country to country, we have to have some common set of standards, and we are defining that in different standardization bodies. And one of the main tasks in the mobile industry have to define an interoperable systems, so that you can roam in between countries, between operators on a global basis. And I think that will be equally important in the future.
So I'm wrong to assume that interoperability necessarily goes with mandatory standards. It can be free standards and interoperability happens.
Look at the internet. It's made up of thousands and thousands of networks that came together organically. Sometimes they're just a handshake, people interconnected, but it was because everybody saw value in interconnecting. And that happened. There have been very, very, very few instances of problems on that score. I think the market has worked. It's worked phenomenally well.
Jan, you spend all your life in these standardization bodies. As you said earlier, for many years on the telecom side with ZC, 3GPP, and more recently you said with IETF and more the internet world. What is could you contrast the two experiences? I mean, is it the same sort of guys, the same sort of culture, the same pace of development of the standards? So,
I think it's a very different culture since the result is very different. And in 3GPP, even though there are technical people, engineers working there, very skilled people, in 3GPP there is, you produce specifications, paperwork, but behind that is of course that you have evolved and developed a system which will work. And then you go back home and implement it. In IETF, for instance, you produce protocols, and there you test the protocols. You come there with software, actually write software and see that it works. So, the interoperability is already there. The interfaces are working. And when we now are entering open source community and bringing those kind of software into our system, that's a community where individuals produce a software package which will work, which you can download in the best of worlds. But there are at least, there are different ways of working. Same kind of people, but different culture and different results from the standardization, even though the aim is the same. So.
I was amazed to learn that earlier today, that large manufacturers were relying on open source standards. I think this is amazing.
I think we are doing that on different level, of course. We are using open source software like Linux, for instance. But now when we are talking about network function virtualization and have a virtual environment, we have initiated this Open NFV. It's an organization which started 1 year ago, where we try to take open source components from different open source communities and integrate them and having a reference platform. That's our way of trying to utilize the force behind open source development. And then, even though at the end we should integrate it and have a common set of interfaces and functions in there, so that one can take and develop further and differentiate. That's very important, of course, that we cannot just produce things for free, which are open, but we have to differentiate and be profitable companies. So.
Yeah. Now, I was wondering whether I could perhaps have a bit of help from the room, because I try to gently initiate this discussion on whether there might be in the galaxy some non-contestable bottlenecks, and we heard Len quite rightly coming back on spectrum, and Jan saying yes, spectrum is really important. But I'm sure you all bored talking about spectrum. So I'd like to hear something about new? Do we all agree, apart from spectrum and of course the old reliable copper pairs, there are no bottlenecks in the digital ecosystem? Tony, you don't see any? Do you agree with that? Say something. What could, just a suggestion, to have them reacting. What would be a bottleneck in the digital ecosystem beyond spectrum and the copper loop?
Microphone.
Content. Yeah, content, says Tony, which absolutely. BT would agree, I think. Yeah. Thank you, Tony, and sorry for putting you on the...
I don't know why you put me on the spot here,
Actually, he suggested to me, says, if you see people fall asleep, just ask them, what do you think? So I'm just following up on your suggestion.
Asleep, in fact. It was very interesting.
It's a great suggestion. I think you can stop there.
No, I mean, I suppose I was struck by several. I did find the conversation very interesting and the interventions very interesting. I thought Thomas's intervention was very interesting because we don't talk about type 1, type 2 errors perhaps in the way that we should. We all remember the provisions of new and emerging markets that we had in yesteryear, which has gone off the topic, and rightly so. I mean, nobody could define it, and eventually we squared the circle, as it were, by saying if the market wasn't sufficiently stable that we couldn't define it, then that was a new and emerging market. But I look at these kind of topics and discussions and apps and see that, very often, the cautionary rules should apply. If in doubt, leave it out and don't do anything. And I think you make a good point about competition law because, you can adapt, I think, competition, your interventions in these markets and use competition law as a means to determine, has something stabilized or is there a real bottleneck or is it just something that's...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And sorry again. And Kevin and Tom will agree with me that Irish people are the most reliable. Thank you. Thank you for that. Other input from the room to stir a bit this debate. I knew Erzberta could rely on you. Hungary does well as well. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution.
Erzsébet Vittori from the European Competitive Telecommunications Association. So I think what you said, the copper loop will remain a bottleneck, but I would really broaden that. It is actually the fixed access network, I think, that will remain a bottleneck, really regardless of whether it is made of copper or fiber. So I would just really say that whatever it is made of, fixed access networks will remain bottlenecks. Equally, I found the discussion very interesting and very inspiring, and maybe just a couple of comments and questions with regard to some of the statements that have been made. I think that for Europe, really the regulatory model, which is based on addressing the enduring bottleneck, the fixed access networks, and opening them up to competition, has created a win-win situation. So in Europe, we have seen falling broadband prices, falling fixed broadband prices, and for those lower prices, actually increasing speeds being included in bundles and also additional services being included in bundles, which has then driven enormously take-up of broadband in Europe. So it has really led to a situation where broadband take-up has increased from 30% to 73% in 2014. And you would think that these falling prices are kind of counterintuitive of investment incentives and revenues. But really the interesting thing is that it is not, because the very high level of take-up has really increased fixed broadband revenues. So if you look at the evolution of fixed broadband revenues in Europe, it was, I think, 17, sorry, I will just give you the exact figure. It was 19 billion euros in 2011, and then fixed broadband revenues increased to 37 billion euros in Europe in 2015. So this really shows that actually the European access regulation regime has been a win-win for consumers and for industry. For consumers, lower prices, more interesting, more innovative products, and then for the industry, a very significant revenue increase from fixed broadband. I know that some people argue that revenues are overall decreasing, but clearly revenues are decreasing from the more traditional voice and SMS services, which, let's just put it this way, they are not the killer applications of the 21st century, right? It is also very interesting that you've raised the question of kind of network investment or investments CapEx levels, and them being very strikingly high in the US, which I think is kind of at the center of a heated discussion here in Brussels. So, does the US have more investment or does Europe have more investment? But I think the issue here is really the question of network investments and the question of network coverage, because CapEx in itself can be anything. It could include handset subsidies, CPE, whatever. But I think when actually we look at fiber network coverage, Europe is slightly ahead of the United States. So Europe has a little bit more fiber to the home, a little bit more FTTX, but pretty comparable actually. Where the US is ahead is next generation cable, because historically the US has had a very, very large cable footprint. But when it comes to the new investments, Europe, with its access regulation regime,
but the message is Title II is not such a bad thing.
No, the thing I want to key off is the assumption of the enduring bottleneck. I think that's a factual question. I think you have to look at the facts to know that. So more than 80% of US households have access to networks of 100 megabits or more. We're building 12.5 million fiber lines. Verizon's already got 18 million fiber lines to the home. I think that the problem here is this. If you look and say, gee, I represent resellers who rely on those networks are sort of platforms for those people. It's a dangerous argument if those networks are competitive for several reasons. One is, where do you stop? I mean, you could go right through operating systems and search engines and everything else and say we have to open all these things up as platforms of innovation for other companies. But you run a very real risk of depressing investment, and I think that's what's happened in Europe. The reality is, if you have a sort of unbundling model, the regulator has to set a rate at the wholesale level. And the reason I say that's like walking a tightrope, if you set it too low, you could get low retail prices to end users, but you've just destroyed incentives to invest by the incumbent, as well as incentives to invest by competitors. If you set it higher, you may well have a very fat and happy monopoly, but it might not be high enough to drive competitive investment. So I think all I'm saying is, don't suggest there's an enduring bottleneck without looking at the facts, particularly in the cities where the competitors want to compete, where you have multiple networks, at least in the US, multiple networks competing with each other, and we should trust the market.
Elisabeth, I will come back to you in a minute, but I've got strict instruction from BEREC that this session shouldn't be about the usual stuff, It should be about the thing up there, and you're dragging it back to the ground. So, no, forgive me. So, we'll come back to it. I first wish to give Tom the opportunity of injecting some fresh blood in this debate. I'll come back to you afterwards when we.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Tom Kodrowski from the Cedar Tree Advisory Service. Having worked to promote competition both in the electronic communication sector and in the water and wastewater sectors, I sort of feel quite qualified to sort of cover it. And I want to go back to Len's point about not sort of pigeonholing yourself as a utility. When I was at the FT Ethno Summit on Tuesday, I felt that some of the chief executives were doing precisely that, because they were complaining that the more data people were consuming, the less they were paying for it, and surely there should be some sort of volumetric charge, and the more you pay, well, the more you use, the more you pay. So presumably, all of you on the panel would sort of say that's not a good model to follow, if indeed we don't want to go down the sort of utility model. But maybe some people do.
I think the market should find the right pricing model. In some cases, it'll be a volume-based model. You'll sell things in buckets. In other places, you may do sponsored data. You may do zero rating. There are any number of opportunities you could find as you invest in these networks, as you create specialized service for specialized needs. I think we're very different from the utility, but I do worry about the terminology of utility because it tends to put you in a box.
I'll do it with a joke, but I've always found that debate very strange. The people that want to use your service the most, you penalize them. And then we discuss about innovation. I think it's a dangerous way to look at things. And it's a way to look at things that's very oriented versus ourselves, whether we're a telco or a OTC, whether the winners are the ones which look at the customer, not themselves. I know that being Roman, it looks very much Catholic now, but we need to forget ourselves if we want to survive in this world, because everything changes so fast that if we look at it from the perspective of ourselves short term, we limit the possibilities of doing things long term.
Yes, the lady there.
Hello, my name is Vesela Gladichova. I'm from MLEX here in Brussels. I have a question, first of all, related to the BEREC's OTT report. According to the three categories, I just wanted to get your views on whether a video OTT service such as Netflix, under which category would it fall out of the three? And another question, if I may, specifically directed to Google. I know that Google wants to establish a collaboration with European telecom operators. So I just wanted to find out what your plans are exactly in terms of that collaboration. What are you trying to get out of it, and what kind of time frame are you looking at? Thank you very much.
Okay. So two questions. Shall we ask Thomas to answer the first one? So Netflix, does it fall into OTT 0, 1, 2?
I was not the author of this report. So, and I have the feeling, seeing some very dark eyes which are really resting on me, that some of the authors are here in this room. So to start, I would say it's OTT2, because it's quite easy. It's not a classical ECS provider. It doesn't compete with ECS providers, so it should be OTT2. And if that surprises you, that means no special regulation foreseen, so far as I have understood this report correctly.
Well, thank you, Thomas. That was a test.
Sometimes
Okay. Professors need to take tests to see.
Okay.
Thank you, Thomas. Carlo, on the concrete plans between...
So, first of all, the motivation. I think there are two levels of motivation. One motivation is we realize that we cannot do certain things alone. It is very difficult to innovate and bring certain services to the market fast alone. So we need allies, and we need to do it together with companies that have this ability. So this is the initial motivation. The second one is because we are in all of European economies, and because we see what happens when people use the internet. We saw small and medium companies become global exporters. We see the benefits that the web brings to the economy. We are convinced, absolutely convinced, that by exploiting the local strengths of the economies, we can do more. And our limit as Google is, it's very difficult to go and propose those services linked to developing the economy, SMBs and the rest, with our sales forces, because we don't have enough, and we'll never have enough. So if we find the motivation for telcos to say, okay, why don't we go together and propose cloud computing to SMBs? Why don't we go together and propose that service that will make people able to better manage their health or their house or their security or their safety or anything? We hope it's faster, we hope it's more convenient for people, and we hope, honestly, we also hope that it helps the economy. We do believe that all those elements are very positive for the economy, and this is the motivation.
Before I go back to Herzbert, on bottlenecks, yes?
Thanks. I'm Domagoj Jurjevic from Croatian Regulatory Authority. And maybe a question for Professor Horen. Regarding last sentence that Netflix, not going into the definitions of OTT 0, 1, and 2, that Netflix is not competing with telecom operators. So maybe I can agree on that, but what if in future we will have Netflix 0, Netflix 1, Netflix 2, with sports content, with movies content, with everything, and what will happen with operators, or do they will have to change their attitude in order to keep their revenues from IPTV or cable TV users?
Yes, they will.
So the question is, do they really compete or not?
Well, when I finished my answer, I said, Thomas, the question was so easy that I could answer it easy. But you have seen this guy from German Telekom this morning who was standing up, and I thought, what would happen if the guy from the German Telekom would ask that question? Because they have similar media services like Netflix. So there you see your question, of course. Netflix is quite easy because it's a simple company with simple services. What is happening with a kind of Google for the poor, Deutsche Telekom, which has a lot of services? And how do you measure now competing? That is exactly my problem I have with competing. I don't know. It depends on markets, and we have to find a market definition for that. And if German Telekom is doing it, of course, that has a lot of surprises in it regarding markets. So I cannot answer your question because it was so complicated. I can only return this question to the people here in the first row. That's all I can do.
Deutsche alphabet. Yes, gentlemen at the back. Could you bring them? Oh, sorry. Yes, the microphone is coming to you.
Johannes Theis from the German Broadband Association. So everything that I say is, of course, always limited to the German market. And I was hoping, as you said, that this session is not going to drag us back to what we had this morning, although interesting it was and it may be. But now I see that somehow things are getting back. And when we talk about markets and type of where OTTs may compete or may not compete, I think it's pretty clear that neither Facebook nor Skype is building huge networks, at least not in Germany or somewhere else in Europe. So for me, I think that's the first critical differentiation we should make, that if it's any kind of competition, it will be a competition in services and not a competition in networks. So any discussion to kind of talk about network regulation in the context of OTTs is just not part of the debate. It's rather a discussion on services, and there we should be very clear. When we talk about networks, it's an entire different field. Then we can see if the US is actually that much better off in terms of investment figures. When you take the investment rate, it's actually not that good. When you take off choice of consumers, 75% of consumers cannot really choose between operators. I mean, that's a totally different environment, and I think there Europe is quite good. But really, to make it clear, distinguish between services and networks is seriously one of the key things we should do when we talk about competition and competition between OTTs and traditional network operators. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a comment, I guess, more than. So we will slowly come to the end of this session, but Herbert, I promise we would come back to you now that we've heard a contribution on the bottlenecks, the upper layer bottleneck. Thank you for your patience.
I would certainly agree with Johannes that actually kind of, I think, when we are discussing bottlenecks and very much kind of a fact-based exercise, I would totally agree that this has to be fact-based, but I think facts coming from independent sources, that when we discuss about connectivity, so really access to the internet, networks, there is where we actually very clearly have enduring bottlenecks, which will not go away simply because the economics of network duplication are not changing, regardless of whether that fixed network is made of copper or fiber. It is in extremely limited areas where you have economic space to have 3 parallel networks. In most places, the maximum is really 1 telecoms network and 1 cable network. And in Europe, we do not have too much cable, so it's only about 50% of Europe. That is different in the US. I think that in terms of regulations and competition's impact on investments, actually in Europe, access regulation has been evidenced by facts. a key enabler of investments by challenger operators. So actually challenger operators are behind quite a lot of fiber investments themselves, but more importantly, they have been triggering via competitive pressure investments by the incumbent operators. That is not entirely different from the dynamic is that American operators were not investing originally in cities where Google Fiber was, but when Google Fiber started that investment, then they responded to that competitive pressure. But access regulation in Europe has been really key to this virtuous circle in terms of investment levels. Investment levels have been very consistently and gradually increasing in Europe. NGA coverage has been increasing in Europe. It's at 68% today, and it is expected to, we are expected to have about 80% FTTX coverage in 2020 under a very competitive environment. The US is expected to actually have less FTTX coverage by 2020 under the current regime.
I'm unfamiliar with the study that says we would have less. But in any event, my answer is, and I think you've sort of agreed with it, is let's check the facts. And it's a fact-specific inquiry, and I think if you look in many, many urban markets, you find multiple competing networks. Certainly that's the case in the US. You find many competing networks outside urban markets. Right now, you typically have throughout the US, 2 wired networks, 4 to 6 wireless networks, and of course satellite broadband on top of that. But the only thing I would urge is look at the facts. If you find competitive markets, trust the market. I think the concern is there's too much of an inclination to conclude in default there is an enduring bottleneck, or even if there is competition, these are platforms for innovation. We've always regulated them. We're going to continue to regulate them. If you go down that road, the net neutrality doesn't stop at the network, right? Unbundling doesn't stop at the network. You could go through the entire ecosystem on a theory like that.
Okay. Before handing over to Fatima, I would like, if you allow me, Carlo, to ask you a question. And you see, this is a very friendly audience that couldn't find any bottleneck outside the copper and the fiber loops. But Len just said net neutrality doesn't stop at the network, which is a bit in contrast with the previous discussion where nobody could give me an example of a bottleneck. But assuming, Len is true, and assuming the parliament that will look at platform in a couple of years is less friendly about bottlenecks in the ecosystem than this friendly audience, Mike, the question that I'm asking myself is, would you rather, in terms of the Google public policy strategy for the coming years, would you rather push for being regulated by these professional, evidence-based regulators, or lobby to escape that and fall into the hands of MEPs that might sort of come up with, I don't know, neutral search, for example. I don't know what you do with this one. Neutral search. Nobody knows what it is, but it will be in the I think it's not such a stupid idea to go for these guys, very friendly. Write clever report, although German professors do not like them, but they are very critical.
That's not for us to judge.
Okay, so you're a Democrat, you leave it to the...
I mean, we play the game, It's like in a football team, you said, can I choose my referee? I mean, I play the game. The referee is chosen by someone else, and it should be chosen by someone else. Then we should respect the rules and go ahead. But we shouldn't choose the referee if we play football. And we love to play football. It's a nice game.
Wonderful, fair play answer. Thank you. Sorry for that. Fatima, shall we first applaud the panelists? Because they did a great job. Merci. Tu dois y aller.